Shalom. This is part 4. Hebrew presents Black History, giving honor and praise unto Yah, the creator and the maker of heaven and earth. We left off in part 3 speaking about this here, the shadow of Egypt. This right here is Inuit Coeptis Novus Ordo Seclorum. Our project has been crowned with success, the new order of the world. Okay, then you got America with the obelisk. You got Egyptian, I'm figuring this Giza pyramid, and then you got the obelisk in Egypt. So you see America and Egypt. And as we went over in another video on my YouTube channel entitled The Hyksos in Hebrews Part 1, went over emphatically about the many correlations between the American society and the society in the aspect of what we will know and understand as ancient Egypt. Okay, now, want to sit there and go over as we went over Deuteronomy 28, verse 68. All right, it speaks about the house of Israel going over into the land of captivity. That is to say, the Mizraim, which Israel understood as the land of bondage in ships. Okay, now, as we read, this right here is what it's speaking about. This here is a diagram. Oh, my fault. This right here is a diagram speaking about and showing what we understand as the Atlantic slave trade and the slave ships. Now we're going to sit there and go and show a correlation between this, Father willing, during this and if need be the next segment of this presentation. This being Hebrew Presents Black History Part 4. Okay? So that way we can gain some understanding emphatically of what we're talking about and what we're presenting. All right? So let's move on, if we will. And we are now back into our reference material. This right here being Hebrew Heritage of Black Africa. We're going to go to page 50 and reread the following. And it says, Maurice Abadi, a French historian, asserts that the Semitic origin of the Fulani of the Niger cannot be questioned. He believes Jews from North Africa also joined their brethren many years later in the 2nd century AD to found the Empire of Ghana. Professor Williams, speaking about Joseph Williams, not Chancellor Williams, Professor Williams thinks it therefore is not surprising to find the Fulani also living in the neighboring lands of the Cameroons and Senegal. So that right there just goes to show you about the expanse of that particular tribe called the Fulani. Now the French refer to them, if I remember right, as the Peul, but they themselves call themselves Fulani. All right, so that way we can gain some understanding of what we're talking about. I have a book here, another secular reference. It's entitled A History of West Africa by Basil Davidson. Now, on page 200 of this book, we're going to read something concerning the history of Western Africa. And it reads as follows, brothers and sisters. So that way we can gain some understanding of what we're talking about. And under the title, The Beginning of the Atlantic Slave Trade, trying desperately to find new sources of free labor, the Spanish rulers began sending out Spanish people under conditions no better than slavery. But they could not find enough of them. Where else to look for slaves? The answer, in their mind, the answer was West Africa. Already, the Portuguese and Spanish had imported a few West African captives into their own countries. Now they began to carry West African captives to the West Indies and the mainland of the Americas. So it speaks about who the Spanish and the Portuguese who were involved in the slave trade. Now, brothers and sisters, in the year 1494, brothers and sisters, Spain and Portugal, they made a treaty that is referred to as the Treaty of Tordesillas or Tordesillas. If I'm mispronouncing it, let me know. But it's spelled as Tordesilles. And that is when Spain and Portugal decided to divide it, how they was going to deal with the Atlantic Ocean and carrying our ancestors in slavery. It is called the Treaty of Tordesillas, and that was done in 1494. As stated, pardon me if I mispronounced it. If I did, please correct me. I am open to constructive criticism. Now, getting back into this portion right here. in this portion. Let's read this one more time. It says, but they could not find enough of them. Where else to look for slaves? The answer was West Africa. Already, the Portuguese and Spanish had imported a few West African captives into their own countries. Now they began to carry West African captives to the West Indies and the mainland of the Americas. Now, for those who are familiar and for those who have been following along, we distinctly, for those who remember, when I showed the picture before about Spain and Cadiz and so forth and so on, I distinctly asked the listeners to remember one particular thing that led off into what is called to the West Indies. Now, the reason why I asked people to remember that is because of what we just read. And it distinctly shows it right here. This here being an example of what happened on the slave ship. Now, this, of course, is from the British aspect of it, but there wasn't that much difference between the British and the Portuguese and the Spaniards slave ships, because they were all slave ships. This right here shows emphatically where the people were scattered after they scattered into what we call Western Africa. We showed that map in part 3. Now, this right here shows where there was slaves taken, and then those who went into the West Indies, slaves was taken. Now let's pay attention to over here, because it distinctly shows Liverpool. It shows, as we call Nantes and Bordeaux, and this right here, as we will know, is Spain. Brothers and sisters, Spain was heavily involved in the slave trade, as we already read in this particular book right here. Let's continue into another part so that way we can gain understanding concerning this. Remember, Spain in the Bible is Tarshish, and Tarshish is where the land of Cadiz was. Remember this particular map right here? We went over Cadiz, and part of it says to West Indies from Cadiz, Spain, right here. We already went over in part 1 what Tarshish is. All right, so let's move on. And it says in part, in our continuation, thank you for the time. Lastly, they had to turn these captives, or those who were still alive after the crossing of the seas, into slaves. But Spanish arms and organization, together with the golden profits of the slave trade, proved too strong for them to even turn a blind eye. In the year 1515, the Spanish shipped back to Europe their first cargo of West Indian sugar, then an expensive luxury, and in 1518, a grim date in the history of the Atlantic slave trade, the Spanish carried their first cargo of captives directly from West Africa to the West Indies. After that, throughout the 16th century, the slave trade grew rapidly. Now, it says this, also in another part. In the first stage or side of this trade, merchants in the big ports of Western Europe bought and shipped to Western Africa goods such as cottons, alcoholic spirits, metalware, and firearms. See how important that is, because in the scriptures, in Ezekiel, it speaks about the people of Tarshish, which we identified in part 1 as Spain, as having some of them same things. You understand? It speaks about them having the cottons, the tin, and all these other kind of minerals of the earth and things of the earth that they traded along with African chiefs. And the people that the African chiefs sold were those scattered tribes of Israel that fled into there to escape the Roman and the Greek persecution. That is very important to let it be known and understood. Right now, this also says this was a commercial system which greatly helped to build the industrial and technical progress of Western Europe in the 18th and 19th centuries, and especially in the progress of Britain and France. Right here, the slave trade helped the European nations. So we have to sit there and know and understand what emphatically that right there, brothers and sisters, is talking about. It is speaking about the people who scattered into Western Africa and were later taken as slaves. Concludes part 4. Shalom.